Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I have Theresa Hollema, our Cabo visiting expert, joining us today for our webinar. And my name is Emily Spranger. I am an academic trainer in the Center for Teaching and Learning. And thank you so much for joining us. Today, Theresa will be discussing inclusive global virtual teams. And for today's webinar, brief reminders, this is being recorded and we will post it in our CTL webinar LibGuides page for future reference. And please feel free to utilize the chat. If you do use the chat and you want everyone to see your comments, please make sure you use the drop down option and select everyone. Otherwise, those comments only go to Theresa Hollema and I. And I guess without further ado, I will pass this right on over to Theresa. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Welcome, everyone. I'm really excited to be here with you and explore the topic of global inclusive virtual teams. So recently there was a survey by Globalization Partners, and they said that 30% of the surveyed work and connect with somebody internationally every day. And if you go up to once every 2 days or once every 3 days, then you're getting up to 50% of the people surveyed. I find that an interesting group because not only are they working with people sitting far away from them, so geographic distance, but they're also working across cultures. And that for me is an interesting topic, and I'd like to explore that with you today. So my name is Theresa Hollema, and I recently wrote a book called Virtual Teams Across Cultures. And I'd like to share with you some of the insights I gained while writing that book and also what has come up ever since the book. Because one thing we're seeing is that globalization, working across cultures, working from a distance is not going to stop. In fact, many of my clients are cutting travel. So they're cutting their travel budgets because they like the cost savings, the technology is improving, and our planet is in code red. So the travel is decreasing, and yet we still need to collaborate and get things done from a distance to meet our strategic goals. So how do we do that, and what do we need to think about? And that's what I'd like to explore with you during this hour. So let me go to my slides. And as Emily said, please ask questions if you'd like, and we can have a bit of a dialogue going as well. So as I mentioned, I have written a book, Virtual Teams Across Cultures. And just to give you a little bit of background about myself, I'm an American. I came to Europe. I came to Europe more than 20 years ago to work on a 3-month project. And I ended up marrying our consultant, who's a Dutchman, which is why I am now located in the Netherlands. But I work across the globe, as many of you do as well. I have a business background, an MBA, but I was always interested in this cultural dynamic as I was leading projects and acquisitions and things like that. Sometimes this cultural dynamic was really a source of creativity, and sometimes it was just a source of frustration. And I wanted to understand that more deeply. So 15 years ago, I became a cultural consultant. But then I wanted to go deeper with teams. So about 10 years ago, I studied to become a team coach. And then 7 years ago, my clients were saying, we're working across cultures, we're working in teams, but we're also working virtually. Can you help us understand that? And so I've been thinking about this topic for a long time, well before pandemic, as many of you have as well. And I brought it all together in this book. So as I was writing the book, I held this question: how do geographic distance and cultural diversity impact how people think, feel, and act on a virtual team? Because it does. And I wanted to explore why and how. And I used 3 sources. The first was my own observations from my own practice, from my own training and consulting practice. The second was insights from academic research, because there's a lot in academia that is so interesting regarding research and models and insights and things of that sort that doesn't make it into the business community. And I love that science practice link. So I read hundreds of papers just to go deeper into what the research was saying. And by the way, many of these research are not MBA students paid for being part of a study. They are really in the wild. And that makes it so interesting for people who are practitioners like myself. And then finally, I interviewed many people who are leaders and part of teams to link that research and the reality together. And so these are the three sources that I tapped into to write the book. Today, I'd like to talk about configuration. I'd like to speak about cultural diversity, which is an important topic for me. I'd also like to speak about biases and inclusion, because this is a critical topic as we work globally. And then finally, what can we do about this? So let's look first at configuration. So here we have three setups, three teams. The first one are all co-located in the same location. They can eat together, lunch together, they can meet together, they run into each other at the coffee machine. They maybe even know each other outside of the office as well. Team two is what we call hybrid. So you have a small group of people in a couple of locations. They can eat together with some of their colleagues, and they can sit in a meeting with some of their colleagues, but with the other colleagues, they need to use technology. And then finally, we have a 100% remote team, team three. No one can eat lunch together, no one can meet together, and they all have to use technology to communicate. So which team is the most challenging? Please just type into the chat, which team is the most challenging, do you think? So Emma has come up with the hybrid, thank you.
Yes,
anyone else?
We've
which one is the
hybrid.
most-
Lots of people posting hybrid.
Great, great, thank you. Yes, it is the most challenging. And it's the most challenging because we have people that are sitting together and they form cliques, they form groupings, subgroupings within the team. What's interesting though, is that before the pandemic, when I was asking this question, everybody was saying team three, because we all believed that sitting and being with somebody on our team was critical, was important. At least we had one person to talk to, not recognizing that those subgroupings were quite dangerous for a team. But the pandemic has shifted our mind, has shifted how we think about this. And one reason is because those hybrid teams, those team two, became, for many of us, 100% remote during the pandemic. And people really enjoyed that equality that they experienced. Everybody was in the same situation. And in addition, people had access to for instance, to the headquarters like they never had before. So that team three, people are experiencing team three in a way, experiencing 100% remote in a way that they enjoyed. And now we're going back to team two hybrid. So we need to really think about that. And I'd like to explore why that is a problem. So with configuration in mind, and by the way, we also need to think about majority, minority. We need to think about where's the team leader. We need to think about which people are near a key resource. So for instance, headquarter or a key stakeholder or a key customer, key supplier. These can all have impacts on the team. And if we're not aware of it, it can be detrimental to the collaboration as well. Good. So with that in mind, I would like to explore cultural diversity. And in my research and in the book, I realized that, or I found that culture impacts a virtual team in three ways. What I call within the team, between the locations, and outside the team. And I'd like to start with within the team. So we've been speaking about cultural diversity for many years, a couple decades, in fact. And we have people who have created models for us, who have done deep research in organizations and created models, such as Fons Trompenaars, Gert Hofstede, and more recently, Aaron Meyer. And what their models have shown us is that we have different ways of thinking about communication, making decisions, building relationships. How should a leader act? How should we collaborate, et cetera. Now, these models are not the truth, but they are a way to help us understand that there are differences. And what's interesting is those differences we have been looking at from, they did their research with people in the same location, but actually we are still experiencing these differences virtually as well. So even though we're sitting in our homes and we're communicating with people in another country, we're still bringing our cultural assumptions with us. And so what does that mean? Well, I'd like to explore one element. I must confess, I used to work with Fons Trompenaars in Amsterdam. So I will use his model. All the models are very good. And I'd like to explore this with you, how one of these models might work. And he has a model of 7 dimensions. So let's look at universal particularism, rules versus relationships. Here's the story. Your friend was driving his car, and he was driving 50 kilometers per hour when he should have been driving 30. You were a passenger in the car. A pedestrian was hit. There's been an accident. The lawyer for your friend comes over to you and says, great news. If you say that your friend was driving 30 instead of 50, the consequences are dramatically reduced. What do you do? Your friend was driving 50, speed limit was 30, pedestrian was hit, you're the only witness. What do you say? Who would like to share in the chat what you would do? I know this is hard. I'm not saying it's a dilemma, it's tough. But what would you do? Anyone willing to let us know? Okay, thank you, Emma. So you would say 50. Good. Why? Anyone else? What would you do? Can't lie for a friend. Okay. So Kate, you have friends who have a habit of speeding. Good. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyone else? I wasn't watching. Okay. Marie, even though you know, you decide not to say. All right. Thank you very much for sharing. Look, I hope this doesn't happen to you, but it is a bit of a dilemma, and we all would struggle with it. But how we go about resolving this dilemma could be different across the world. So for instance, these people who just said, I have to look back at chat, but for instance, Emma and Kate, you said you wouldn't lie, and I understand. But what if it was your mother driving, or a close family member, or your partner, or someone really close to you? All of a sudden, maybe 30 might not be such a bad idea after all. And what we see across the world is that there are some cultures that say, well, actually, my friend is as close as if it was my partner, my mother, et cetera, my family member. So how close do we feel? Well, let me share with you, Trompenaars has asked this question because they have a database of more than 100,000 respondents who have answered this question, answered this dilemma. And I'd like to share with you what we find around the world. So they ask, what right does your friend have to expect that you would say the lower amount? My friend has a definite right. That friendship is so close. My friend has some right. My friend has absolutely no right. I would tell the truth. And this is what we see across the world. These is just an example. It's just a model. It's not that everyone is going to answer exactly like this, but we do see some trends. And you see the countries that are more on the top, Switzerland, Australia, US, we call those more universalists. One rule, follow the rules, standards, procedures, contracts, laws. This is how we guide ourselves. Whereas countries more towards the bottom, we call more particularist, more flexibility, relationship-based. We build trust based on who you are, not based on what has been written in the contract. Now, what if I was working for a company and they sent me to different places around the world of their company, and where I went was generally homogeneous. So the first place they sent me was Finland. Most of the people there were from Finland. They all struggled with the dilemma, and in the end, they all raised their hand and said 50. 2 weeks later, same company, they sent me to China. And most of the people from there were from China. They all struggled with the dilemma and they all raised their hand and said 30. Same company. And now they have to work together, and now they have to work together virtually as well. How do we do that when we have different assumptions on how to engage with colleagues, how to use rules, what's the meaning of standards, etc. We also see, for instance, in how we communicate. So both Edward T. Hall, Fons Trompenaars, and Aaron Meyer, in their models, all have this idea of communication, art of persuasion, sort of this inside out or outside in. For instance, Hall thinks of how much do we need to know about each other in order to work together? Well, let's get down to business and we can learn about each other later. Whereas some cultures say, no, I need to know all about you before we can start working together, because I need to know what makes you tick. Aaron Meyer, how do we persuade people? Well, get to the point, use bullet points, tell them what they need to know. No, for others, I need to know the whole big picture, the whole context, and then get to the point. And if we don't understand this as we're working across cultures virtually, we can end up with misunderstandings, frustrations, and really just not getting to the place we want to as far as our collaboration. So this is the first way that culture shows up in a virtual team, what I call within the team members. Before I move on, any questions or reflections, comments? Do you recognize this yourself as you work across cultures? Anyone want to share anything in chat?
At this time, I don't have any questions in the Q&A,
Okay,
but if something pops up, I will absolutely share it.
thank you. All right, then I will continue. So that was, as I mentioned, within the team. The second way that cultural diversity shows up in a virtual space is what I call between the locations. And this has to do with how we as humans think about things that are far away. So, for instance, if you think about a date in December in your agenda, you kind of have an idea of what it's about, but it's pretty far away and you don't have a whole lot of emotion tied to it. But tomorrow, you know exactly what you need to do, how you need to prepare, who you're going to see, and you may even have a little emotion tied. You may look forward to seeing an old colleague or dread for a difficult conversation. As humans, we think about people that way as well. My colleagues that are in the same location, Susan did a great presentation this morning, and Jose was hilarious. They're unique, they're very individual. But our colleagues far away, Spanish, French. We use abstract words to describe things that are far away. And often when working across cultures, we will use cultural stereotypes. They are late or always never on time or never get to the point or whatever that may be. And what else happens is my colleague next to me reinforces my thinking. Yeah, I spoke with them last week and it was also hard. I couldn't stand it. And there we go into a downward spiral of an us versus them. So this is why that hybrid can be really tricky, because as humans, if we, at a minimum, we think of things far away as abstract and we don't really connect. We don't really understand each other. And then on a detrimental scale, it can turn into an us versus them. I experienced this when I was working for a Dutch company with a shared service center in India. And so what happened was they didn't have a whole lot of connection. The Indians are over there and the Dutch were over here. They didn't know each other well, but they had to get work done together, actually complex work. But what happened was they would send an email and it would just stay. Somebody would receive it, they would read it, not understand it, ask their colleagues, and just try to figure it out themselves. They didn't have enough relationship to continue that conversation, which is what they really needed. They needed a back and forth because of the complexity of the work. They needed to ask questions, motivate each other, understand, get some feedback, having that dialogue, even using the communication tools. but they just felt far away from each other. They had an us versus them. So instead of psychological distance, what we really need is psychological closeness. We need in these hybrid teams to actively and intentionally build those bridges across those cultures so that we can feel connected and get things done together. And part of that is understanding using the technology well and understanding each other's culture as well. So that's the second way. And one would ask, well, how does one do that? Well, let's look at a concept like trust. So often when we're building trust and we're in the same location, we sort of try to get some affinity going. Okay, where did you go to school? What soccer team do you support? Do our kids go to the same school? Or, do we eat at the same restaurant? Let's go have lunch together. And then we start to work together. So we start to build this relationship trust, and then we start to see if we have competence in each other as well. But in the virtual space, our kids don't go to the same school. We don't support the same football team. We don't go to the same restaurants. We can't go have lunch together. That can't happen. What does happen, though, is something called swift trust. People arrive in a team ready to trust. But that trust is very short, it's very fleeting, and has to be replaced by competence trust in the near term, and then relationship trust in the long term. So we need to set up our collaboration so that people are quickly proving to each other that they're reliable, that they're competent, I'm open, I'm motivated, I'm here to help. So we need to have people interacting quite quickly with each other. And then over time, we start to build that deeper trust as we are working together. Okay, so with that in mind, let's do a little exercise. Here, you are the leader of a team of 6 people. 2 are sitting in the US, 2 are sitting in Mexico, and 2 are sitting in Brazil. All equally competent. You have 3 tasks that require 2 people. How are you going to divide the work? Well, split the tasks by country, right? The US does 1 task, the Mexico does 1 task, and the 2 people in Brazil do 1 task. Cross-country groupings. So Mexico and US, US and Brazil, Brazil and Mexico, or just do the work yourself. It's so much easier than trying to coordinate these people. What do you think? How would you organize the work? Anyone like to say in chat?
I will come on here. Let me know if you have any thoughts about how you would divide it. Oh, Emma mentions depends on the tasks. And Kate says,
good. But
Kate says 1.
Emma and others, we are creating a team for the long term.
Okay. Someone mentioned 1, split the 3 tasks by country.
Thank you, Kate. Anyone else? Good.
Oh, a couple people are popping in there.
Nice. Thank you, Lori. Thank you, Rosalind. Okay. Great. So nice. I'm glad a lot of you are saying 2, because yes, if you want to build trust in your team and you want to start building those connections across the locations so we don't have us versus them, then yes, we need interdependence. We need to organize it by 2. But let's be honest, 2 is more challenging, right? I mean, you're telling me I'm sitting in Mexico and you're telling me I have to work with someone in the US, whereas my Mexican colleague is sitting right next to me. That doesn't make sense. And you will get some pushback. But if you are thinking long-term for the team, the connection and the trust, then the second, interdependence, is really a nice way to begin. And then over time, once that trust is built and the team feels connected, then we can go back to 1, which seems more practical. But at least in the beginning, we need to help people to build those bridges across the locations. Okay, so that's the first way within the team, between the locations, how culture shows up. And then the third way is what I call outside the team. What's interesting about global virtual teams is that they have people sitting in very different locations. So the team can be working really well together, harmonious, energized, sharing information, creative, etc. But because the people are sitting in different locations, the local culture can influence the team in very unexpected ways. And if the team leader and the team members aren't open for that, it can turn into a difficult situation. While I was writing the book, I was very fortunate to have a long-term relationship and follow a team for over a year and a half. Half the team was in London and the other half of the team was in India. And they were a great working team. It took a long time, but finally they were sharing information, lots of trust, really great connection. One of the women in India returned to her village and needed to be replaced. How should we replace her? Well, according to the team leader in London, based on merit, absolutely. We should promote somebody in the team because that person has done a great job. Well, now wait a minute, said the HR director in India. We want to promote somebody based on qualifications and certifications because that's how we judge quality and that's our market here in India. So we have a dilemma. Luckily, the team leader was open to that conversation, or else it could have been a real disaster. And this is a kind of story we hear a lot because people are in different locations. What also happens is that the people in these locations feel the tension of the norms within the team versus the norms within their country. And they could have conflicting identities. We see this a lot on global teams, right? Global versus local, my local plant versus my global team objectives, et cetera. And recently, there was some very nice research that started to think about these identity conflicts in people who work on global teams. It just came out, so I'm still digesting it myself. But I think it's really nice because it was in the wild. So it was at a multinational organization, this research. And they found that people who could handle this identity conflict well were people that were high tolerance for ambiguity. So let's figure it out. Let's see what happens. High levels of resilience. So this optimism, this believing in oneself. I have a colleague, Mary Jane Roy, who is a consultant on resilience. And for her, this makes sense, that people that are able to go through things are able to as well handle this identity crisis conflict and actually minimize the conflict as well. And then finally, a shared team identity, which makes sense to me. And that's something, it's actually a chapter in my book, which is because we don't have these shared walls and these shared space of a global team, we need something that binds us together, and often that is a shared team identity. So this is some new research. We're continuing to look at these global teams, and that's what I find fascinating. Okay, so those are the 3 ways culture impacts a virtual team, within the team, between the locations, and outside the team. I'd like to take just a second and think about inclusion and exclusion, actually. Imagine that you are working on a project on an international team with colleagues in other countries. What would have to happen to make you feel excluded? Because exclusion is really a tough feeling, right? It's physical as well. It challenges our sense of belonging. What would have to happen for you to feel excluded? Anyone be willing to share in the chat?
We'll just give them just a moment to
reflect on that.
In case anybody wants to share.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Yeah, language barrier, absolutely.
Absolutely. Thank you for putting that in there.
Anyone else? What would have to happen for you to feel excluded?
I'd like to just go ahead and pop this in there. Time zones.
Nice. Okay. Thank you.
When it works for other people, it might not work in other parts of the world as well, too. A couple more things happened in the chat.
Yeah, some of these are really good. Yeah, thank you. So, they're all good.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and Kate said, yes, Emily, meetings happen that you can't attend because of time zone issues. So I'm going to go ahead and read this off too, just so that in the recording they won't see this in the chat. So I'm told of decisions that are made afterward, however, not included in the decision-making process. And then another, Marie mentions cultural problems and misunderstandings.
Fantastic. Lovely. Thank you very much. I'd like to explore a couple biases that show up in global virtual teams and that we need to be aware of, because we all have biases, and being aware of our biases actually is the first step to starting to address them as well. So let's look at the first one here. This comes from some nice research by some cultural consultants at Erasmus University, actually not too far from where I am. And they looked at a multicultural team. And the question is, who has the most information? 2 Dutch, 1 German, 1 Chinese. And this has to do with majority-minority grouping. So in this case, clearly the Dutch had the most information. They were sharing with each other. And because they're the majority, they had the information. What's also interesting, though, in this study was that the German person also had a lot of information, because culturally, the Dutch and the Germans are not too far from each other relative to the rest of the team. So the Dutch and the Germans were also sharing information. Who had the least amount of information was from China, was the Chinese colleague. What they noticed happened actually was that the Chinese person was willing to share with the majority, but the information was not going back. And that's where the problems were arising, because information is crucial in all teams, but especially in a virtual team, because if you don't feel like you have all the information, you very quickly feel like you are excluded. This, I came across a real example of this not too long ago. The headquarters in Sweden, and they were implementing a software system in India. And the Swedes found out some information about the supplier, about the consultant that was going to be working on the software. And the Swedes thought, uh-oh, let's not tell the Indian team, we don't want to upset them. So you have this kind of mentality going when you are far away from each other and you're not feeling connected with each other. Very quickly, a bias. Another example, somebody mentioned, I can't remember who, but language bias. Yes, we have these showing up in many different ways. There was recently some research that showed kind of something interesting, but a little bit scary in students. So they took the students and split them in 2 groups, and they received the exact same recording. But the photos that they saw were different. One photo was of a woman who looked American, as an American English speaker, and the other photo was of somebody that looked like they were from Asia. And the students listened to the exact same recording, but they judged the recordings differently. They thought the person who was doing the lesson was less competent from the Asia picture. They understood less of what they said. They comprehended less. Can you imagine? It was the exact same recording. And they thought of them as less friendly, less likable. We do this. We also avoid conversations with people that we don't think we can understand their language. And we complain about them. I hear this all the time. They don't speak clearly, or they have a terrible accent. When I first was dating my husband, Dutch man, we were speaking English as our relationship language. And I just didn't understand him. I kept having to ask, what did you say? What did you say? And I thought, how can I marry somebody I don't understand? Eventually my ear adjusted and I was able to understand him. But that takes some time, and it took some energy, and well, it worked out very well 22 years later. But this is something we need to work on, because we very quickly have a bias. Good. So what are we doing? So we have global virtual teams. We need to think about being inclusive. They are not going away. We're going to continue to work across cultures. and we're going to travel less. I mean, this is going to be a challenge because historically, when we were working with people from other cultures, we could go there, we could experience, we could feel the location, we could see it, we could eat the food, we could smell and use all of our senses to be in the culture. But now that's going away. It has already gone away, but even more so now. So how can we develop cultural competence? How can we understand and work with others and develop that competence to be able to work with others while sitting in our own locations? How can we do that? And that's the question I'm holding a lot. Well, one is develop virtual competence, right? Because we have to be able to use these tools. We have to be able to build trust virtually, et cetera. Develop cultural competence, but doing it together within the team, and then also strengthening the virtual team. And I'd like to spend a moment on developing cultural competence together. But before I do, I'd like to just check, are there any questions or comments before I go forward?
Yes, we do have one question in the Q&A that I would like to ask before we move to this next section. Do you find that, this question's from Emma, do you find that well-established company norms, regardless of culture and location, can offset some of the cultural disconnects and increase swift trust?
Nice question, Emma. Thank you for that. And so having a strong company culture, it can be very powerful when we are working together in the same location, in the same company, across locations and with cultural diversity. So yes, that helps bind us together. But we don't want the company culture to, let's say, crash the diversity that we have, because there is some advantage to that diversity. We have different points of view, different experiences. And as I will show a little bit later, location diversity is very powerful. So yes, it's nice to have values and things that bind us together, saying that we're all part of the same company, but we still want to have this local diversity and this beauty of the cultural diversity to make sure that we are creative and that we're able to serve our global stakeholders as well. So it's both. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Theresa. That's it for now.
Okay. So I'd like to spend a moment on developing cultural competence. How can we do that while sitting in our own homes or our own locations? And when we think about cultural competence, which is the ability to work successfully with people from cultures or belief systems different from our own, we tend to think of them as, let's say, 4 areas of development. And by the way, this journey is continuously ongoing. So first off, self-awareness, being aware of one's own cultural influences, being aware of one's reactions to cultural frustrations, being mindful of one's reactions. Mindset, so having an open mindset to be willing to engage with others and be ready to listen to their perspective and be curious about their perspective. Knowledge, so what is cultural diversity, learning about other cultures, learning about one's own as well, sort of, there is research, what does this say, what can we learn from that? And behavior, adjusting one's behavior to be more open, being more global, being more receptive to others as well. So bringing all those together. So we see that people who have lived abroad and who have traveled extensively develop these 4 components because they have had that opportunity. And perhaps they've had coaching and they've had experiences that have challenged them in that way out of their comfort zone. But how can we do that when we don't have the chance to travel? And I'm one that believes that that can happen while we are working in our virtual teams. So the virtual team is now the place where we can develop cultural competence. And we can do that individually. So we can learn about each other's cultures within the team. We can be mindful of our reactions. So during meetings, as we're reading emails, as we are listening to the others, being curious about the other cultures, right? I'm sitting in the Netherlands right now. Let's say I'm working with my colleagues in India. let me go learn about India. Let me read about it. Let me find out what's happening in the news. Let me focus on learning about the culture of my colleague. And working internationally. So volunteering or getting on projects that are multicultural and multinational as well. So putting ourselves in those experiences. But then on a team level, there's many things we can do as well. We can make cultural diversity a priority. Many teams ignore it. They just say, let's just hope for the best. Everyone arrives for meetings, but we don't then tap into the uniqueness and the diversity of the people who are there and allow them to share those different ideas and different perspectives and different experiences. One idea is every month, a different person from a different country tells us about what's going on there. Tell us about your country. Tell us about your culture. Make that a habit of learning together. They could take a cultural diversity course together, maybe in the beginning, so that, let's say, after a bit of time after the team has started and they're sort of figuring things out, bring in an external consultant to help them find the language and find the way of understanding each other, sort of get a good grounding together. And then finally, even just icebreaker questions when we're having meetings can open up a curiosity and a discovery about each other's culture. So for instance, even a question like, what did you do when you were 10? Or sorry, what did you want to be when you were 10 years old? You start to learn about what it's like to be 10 in Japan or in the US or in Brazil, et cetera. So some of these can really open some curious, interesting dialogues where you are learning more about each other's locations. So there is a lot we can do within the team to help each person develop cultural competence, and then as a team, really bring cultural diversity alive. And we are doing that for a reason, because our clients, our suppliers, our stakeholders, we're doing this for strategic reasons. We have strategic goals that we want to meet. And there is research that shows that location diversity, that fact that people are sitting in different locations, can lead towards creativity. Because we have different networks, we have different information sources, we have different perspectives, we have different education systems. All of this brings different ideas and perspectives towards the conversation. The challenge is that we communicate differently, that we make decisions differently, that we engage in relationships differently, the culture stuff. And that's where we need to really understand and make sure that that doesn't turn into a problem. Good. So this is what I wanted to chat with you about. This is who I am. If you would like to connect with me, I'm very easy to connect with on LinkedIn. I have a newsletter. I have written a book that you can find on Amazon and other online bookstores. But I wanted to share with you some ideas on global virtual teams, being inclusive, being connected. And we are still learning about them, which is great. We're still having researchers who are looking into this so that we can continue to improve how we engage with each other from a distance. I'd love to take more questions or have a dialogue if somebody has anything to say or to share or whatever, maybe your own experiences. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Theresa. I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge on this very important topic. As we can see, obviously, this has been happening for some time before COVID, but I'm moving to a virtual team space. But of course, that may have sped up some things for us. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to post them in the Q&A, or if you would like to raise your hand, I will allow you to speak and we can have a conversation. I do see a question has popped up in the Q&A. Marie would like to know, do you have a recommendation of an instrument we can use to assess cultural competence in an organization?
Nice, Marie. So there are some tools out there. I must confess, I don't have them top of mind. I do know Trumpinars has a tool regarding cultural competence individually. So that's where most tools are. They assess the individual's cultural competence, and then they help the individual to develop through coaching and things of that sort. So I know there's quite a few tools out there, and if you're more interested, we can dialogue offline on this. I don't
Absolutely.
know of one that assesses the organization's cultural competence or that even the team's cultural competence. It's more or less on an individual level.
Okay. And she also said absolutely. So thank you so much for that question. And I'll just give another question popped up in the Q&A. In many of your pictures, you had at least 2 people in each country. Have you found any additional issues when there's only a single person in that country while others work in a larger country, in a larger group in one specific country?
Good, Emma, nice. So these are called isolates, Emma, what you are referencing. So that means one person in a situation, and they are challenging. That is true. However, there is one situation where they are actually an advantage. And that is when you have a group of people who are in one location and either the team lead or a very significant person on the team is outside of the location. So for instance, I in my book, I tell the story of Tony, who was located in Denmark, and he was leading a team in Poland. So he was the leader and he was the isolate, whereas the team was in Poland. 2 things happen. One is that the team then is required to develop processes and procedures to communicate. So you have some structure coming into place because that is a critical stakeholder over there and far away from them. And second is that the team actually were taking on a lot of their own responsibility. They felt empowered. So they were only going to Tony then for really critical things or guidance or coaching instead of the directive management, which could happen if Tony was on site. So there are some advantages when the isolate is a team leader or a critical team member. When the isolates are not, then it's hard. And the isolates have to keep making noise that they are there. And that's when include the main team, the people who are together, really need to think inclusion strongly to make sure everybody is up to speed on information and feeling part of the team.
Thank you so much for that question and that answer. One more in the Q&A. Do you see differences in large virtual teams versus smaller teams?
Interesting, Kate. I guess I look more at different characteristics, but I think that's an interesting question. What I do hear often is people saying that I'm part of a team when you have 25 people or something of that sort, and then they have a team meeting of 25 people. I don't consider that a team. I consider that a group that are perhaps knowledge sharing. A team is really something interdependent, some sort of shared goal as well. And you do get different numbers regarding what's the best, something like 8 people max versus some say 10 people max. So it's an interesting question you have, Kate. I don't have a real definitive answer, but we're still looking.
Okay, thank you. In your experience, is gender an issue in virtual teams across locations?
Nice, Jocelyn. So I'm talking right now, I just introduced the concept of culture. What's nice about cultural consultants now is that we are really thinking in intersectionality. So we are also recognizing that gender plays a role. Different countries have different gender ways of going about with different gender diversity. Race comes into play. So yes, we're starting. If we're spending more time together, then if I'm working with a team, then we're also looking at these other dimensions of diversity as well. Culture is just opening the door. So thank you very much for that question.
Absolutely. And that would probably be, I mean, each one of those sections could be an entirely different webinar for sure.
Exactly.
Emma has one more question. Many remote teams are moving to predominantly asynchronous text-based communication. Do you think this may create further challenges for cultural understanding among team members?
It's so interesting. We're learning as we go. So if we first think about things, you might say, great, we need to use Synchronic, synchronic communication in order to build trust, right? To see each other and build some connection. And some countries will prefer that as well. I want to see you more than maybe others say an email is enough. So we do have that dynamic going on. What's interesting is I pointed out some research in the book, and I see it myself, is that actually sometimes we want to use because many people are speaking a second language, that actually using the tools to reinforce and to bring clarity, using all the tools, can really be an advantage for global teams. We could be in a call together and using the same word, but having different meanings, or we have some understanding issues. So then it's really nice to go to asynchronous tools in order to bring clarity. So I think global teams are really wise to use all the tools to make sure that we have understanding with each other.
I couldn't agree more. And I love your statement as we're learning as we go, because this is still new. It's still all relatively new. It's not like these practices have been in place for quite some time in my experience. So I like your statement there. We're learning as we go, for sure. So thank you so much, attendees, for posting some questions and having some dialogue in here. And I'll just wait one more second just in case somebody else has a last minute question they want to pop in. But it really is interesting. You know, obviously being a virtual team member myself and seeing things that have worked well and things that maybe need improvement, I will say. And so your webinar is very interesting. And of course, your book as well. A very timely presentation, as Dr. Bakari is mentioning here in the Q&A. So thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're in the Netherlands. I think it's rather late there right now. Is that correct?
Thank you. Yes, we're getting to the end, but I really enjoyed this and I appreciated all the comments and questions. So thank you very much. And
absolutely.
Maybe we'll meet again virtually.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for your time, Theresa. Everybody, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.